Lorwyn, Chapter 15. Ileona and her siblings streaked across the night sky, one at each tip of the glowing prison with Maralen suspended at its center. They had crossed almost half of Lorwyn already by way of the fairy circles, and after passing through that particular piece of magic, the stranger was far less confident. Ileona giggled slightly. Perhaps Maralen didn't expect to be taken so far so quickly, or perhaps she was worried about how she was going to get back. Silly stranger, she thought, and she was instantly rewarded by her siblings' musical laughter. Endry and Visa's voices tinkled like bells on the wind. You shouldn't be so quick to judge on appearances. We're tiny, but we're tenacious. Ileona buzzed her wings faster, guiding the forward point of the triangle up towards the clouds. If anything, she and her siblings were growing stronger and livelier as they came closer to the Great Mother's hidden home. Ileona felt, and felt her siblings feel, that Maralen had done herself a favor by settling down, and in doing so had done the siblings a disservice. All three were downright eager to employ some special magics they had if the stranger couldn't remember her place. Spells to render a person silent or stupefied for the duration of the journey. And that was only the beginning. Visa was prepared to give Maralen the head of an ass just to keep her from talking. And on top of that, Endry planned to visit her with an unquenchable thirst so that she'd both be silent and miserable. Ileona privately wished Maralen would tilt her head cockily as she had back on Sig's Shapewater Ferry, just so that she could watch her siblings compete for the right to blight her. Without the Gilt-Leaf Hunter to protect her, however, the stranger's sass seemed to have drained away. By the time the strange procession crested the last big hill before their destination of Glen Elendra, Maralen was silent, possibly anxious. I'd even say docile, Endry said. But not awestruck, Visa laughed sharply. Not yet. The clouds overhead broke, and bright sunlight shone down on Glen Elendra. It was not a large place, barely 100 acres of gently curving hills covered in a thick blanket of trees, shrubs, and grasses. In the daylight, the glen was rife with blooms and blossoms of every size and color, and the air was filled with birdsongs. At sunset, the glen's beauty was quieter, but perhaps more breathtaking. Jasmine flowers bloomed, catching and reflecting in the light, as silver-white moths fluttered between the vines. Sparkle flies and will-o'-the-wisps flickered everywhere, from the forest floor all the way up to the canopy, wreathing the misty grounds and the towering greenery in a festival of light. Ileona angled their course downward, guiding the procession towards the glen. Elendra's obvious exterior beauty was all the non-Fae would ever get to see of the place. Countless layers of the most powerful glamours ever cast by Fae, and therefore the strongest magic in the world, concealed it. Thousands of fairies were hard at work all across Lorwyn, finding and harvesting dream stuff that the Great Mother used however she pleased. And it pleased her to use a large portion of it to keep unwelcome visitors away. Anyone who happened by or sought the glen out instantly forgot about it as soon as they drew near. Even an experienced ranger with a map, 2 cufhounds and a guide could not hope to enter the Great Mother's sacred home. His map would change to confound the trails or vice versa. His dogs would bolt off in separate directions, baying after tantalizing hares, and his guide would lose his memory and all sense of direction. And if that was all he lost, he was luckier than he deserved. For Glen Elendra was not only concealed, but it was also vigilantly protected. The sharpest and fastest fairy cliques patrolled in gentle rolling hills, and woe betide the traveller who met them. Eyes that beheld Oona's glen were destined to be plucked out. Throats that sang its praises were invariably cut, and hearts that gladdened at its splendor were often found transfixed upon the branches of the tallest trees. No strangers were welcome in the glen. Particularly determined or stupid ones were not allowed the chance to return. The glen was not a complete mystery, however, nor was it a forbidden subject among the professional storytellers and tavern-going blowhards of Lorwyn. There were folk tales, of course, lore and legend about secret fairy birthing places, but these were tales designed to discourage, ones that always ended with some variant of the stark homily where the Great Mother and her children had made sure to spread. You can't get into Oona's sacred glen, and you couldn't get out if you did. Ileana plunged through the outermost glamour that protected the glen. As always, she felt a shiver of awe as she was received into the Great Mother's presence. A shiver that she shared with Endry and Visa before they, in turn, shared theirs. Maralen stirred, but she was still subdued and sluggish. If Ileana read the stranger's expression aright, Maralen was more roused by the notion of getting back on the ground than the awesome presence inside Glen Elendra. This was where the Fae began, the source and origin of their entire tribe. No one knew how long the Great Mother had been here, but she was believed to have lived as long as Lorwyn itself. Individual fairies didn't last long, but Oona endured. Oona was the ever-blooming flower. The tiny, flighty fairies were the pollinating bees. They preened, played, and filled the world with a bit more life and light, and then they withered away in a few short years to be replaced by the next generation of Fae. Ileana shuddered, reveling in the majesty of her connection to the Queen. She shared a mind with her siblings on a daily basis, and had since the day they had emerged. But she also shared with the Great Mother. Her voice added to an uncountable multitude joined together in a joyous cacophony of everyone speaking at once. In Lorwyn, there was no secret that was safe from the Fae. They saw and heard everything. In turn, Oona the Great Mother saw and heard everything her children did, and what was more, she understood it all. Every single confused, overlapping syllable. Only a mind like hers could process the deluge of facts, lies, half-truths, and rumours that the fairies brought her in at a steady stream. She never tired of it, and she was always hungering for more, in fact. So her children never hesitated to bring her the latest news and freshest gossip, which was only ever a fairy ring away. Less than 100 feet from the forest floor, Ileana noted with pride how the view inside the glamour was identical to that from without, with the all-important exception of the Great Mother herself. She was here, as she always was, looking as she always did. A constantly shifting woman floating in mid-air, her body woven of flowers in a rainbow of blue, purple, magenta, and white. 2 long spires of clean white wood stood proudly behind her, giving the impression of a throne. Between these spires swayed a gigantic female shape, a woman from the waist up, but all glorious flora from there down. Oona's long, petal-shrouded arms trailed against the surrounding vegetation as she drifted back and forth like a willow in the wind. The whisper of the wind through her flowery form was as soft and as soothing as a mother cat's purr. Yet Maralen is not soothed, Ileana thought. She fluttered near the ground, 20 paces from the outer edge of the Great Mother herself. If anything, I think our new friend is downright agitated. I agree, Endry said. Let's agitate her some more, Visa added. No, no, Ileana said. She turned in the air and hovered at eye level with Maralen. Slow, calm, and respectful. That's what you want to be, missy. Maralen dropped her head, her dark hair completely hiding her face. I'm sorry, the stranger spoke without lifting her face. I realize now that I've made a mistake. I was so very wrong. Visa moved away from her position on the cage, but the spell was not diminished. Is she begging? Not quite, Ileana said. More like lick-spitting, Endry said. Lick-spitting? What's that? That's like what a lick-spittle does. Really, Visa, you should read more. Maralen raised her head, her dark eyes wide and pleading. I'm just a stranger here. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. Iliona's wings buzzed hungrily and she smiled. Glenelendra is hard on strangers, she said. And even if I wanted to turn you loose, which we don't, so we won't. Even if we wanted to release you, you're too interesting. Not to us, you understand. We three think you're an utter bore. But we don't really know what you are, which means the Great Mother doesn't know either, and that's no good, Ileana continued. Not at all. The Fae know all, you see, so Oona has to meet you right away. And then she'll decide what to do with you. Marilen's eyes darted from sibling to sibling. Quietly, her voice shaking, she said, What will she do to me? Whatever she wants, Ileana said. Her siblings laughed. Hush now, weird elf. Keep your eyes and your voice down. It won't help, but it won't hurt either. Marilen's glassy eyes and slack expression made it hard to tell if she had heard and understood. Ileana shrugged, and the gesture spread to her siblings. It was way past time for preparations. The Great Mother was ready to receive her children and their new toy. The great mound of blossoms shuddered, and the woman's figure stretched her arms out to each side. She grew longer and taller, rising up and out. Oona's head bloomed to life, with dark green leaves and snow-white flowers unfolding across its surface. A cloud of fairies buzzed up from her shoulders and circled around her head like a crown, their voices sweet and pure. Oona opened her eyes, each pupil a 5-petaled bloom that rotated in its socket like a pinwheel in a gentle wind. The Great Mother smiled. What have you brought me this time, my children? Oona's voice raised a thrill in Ileana that was 10 times more intense than the one she had felt upon entering the grove. Ileana and Visa echoed it back to her, enriching and magnifying Ileana's rapturous awe with their own. We don't rightly know, Great Mother, so we brought her to you, Ileana said. You did well. Oona listed and swayed for a moment before leaning forward. Now then, my children, bring her closer. Ileana and her siblings returned to the points of the triangle, and together they moved Marilen's enclosure to the center of the glen, where the mother of them all waited with open, loving arms. Captain Sig brought the Shapewater ferry up from the cavern via a side channel, heroically fighting the current until they emerged onto the main stretch of the familiar Wonderwine. Rhys was grateful for the daylight, even though it was a few weak rays of sunshine through a cold, clinging fog. There were troubles behind them, and the unknown ahead, but a new day had dawned. Today they would reach Colfanor's sacred grove. Rhys sighed. It wasn't much. Calling this dawn a good omen was a bit of a stretch, but he resolved to make the best of what he had. Rhys made his way forward to where Bridget had spent all sunset, steadfastly refusing to eat, sleep, or do anything else that might compete for her attention. She looked haggard, but the fierce resolve in her eyes was undiminished. Rhys and Sig both attempted to reassure her that such vigilance was unnecessary, but the archer was as stubborn as a stone. She and her arrows were ready for any foolish elf or bounty hunter who may have tried to follow them through the dark tributaries. Aisling roused herself from a sitting position and followed Rhys to the front of the craft. To her credit, she had not persisted in arguing with Rhys's decision to press on. Her stoic acceptance of the situation came without reservation or complaint, even though it was clear she felt that honor demanded otherwise. Rhys valued this sort of determination in his compatriots, and he appreciated the quiet discipline Aisling showed. Elf packs stood or fell based on strength of their discipline, which in turn hung on the quality of their leadership. He knew this group was far removed from the effortless unity of an elf hunting pack, especially one under such tight command, but he was so far removed from a position of faultless leadership, so far in fact that he would probably never know it again, which only improved his opinion on the Flamekin's elf-like determination. She stood ready in word and deed to follow Rhys, to work without reservation for the greater good of the party, even though it was clear she felt her own goals remained unfulfilled. Aisling joined Rhys and Brigid on the foredeck, with Sig swimming nearby. The entire group was within earshot of each other. "How long?" Aisling asked. "Not long at all," Rhys replied, scanning the banks for a familiar landmark. "I've only come this way a few times and the forest has changed, but we're very close. I can feel it." "How does it feel?" Aisling asked. She kept her voice low and steady, but Rhys heard the longing behind the calm. "I don't understand your question." "Is it familiar? Is it anything like what you felt when the elemental appeared?" "Are you still on about that?" Brigid muttered. Aisling stiffened. "Mind your own business." "Flamekin don't have a monopoly on deeper magic," Brigid replied. "Look, all I'm saying is that you're making too much out of one chance encounter. I watch the elementals for signs all the time. It doesn't always work." "You augur to inform your daily life," Aisling said hotly. "I've got more on my mind than the weather for an upcoming festival week, or whether an expectant mother is going to have a boy or a girl." "And boggarts pray to a pile of mud," Brigid muttered, voicing a familiar Kifkin aphorism about the indivisibility of auguring intertribal relations. Aisling's flame darkened and Rhys decided to end their pointless argument. "Keep your watch, Archer," he said sternly, "or get some rest." "I'll rest when the job is done," she said. "I've got a reputation to protect." The Shapewater ferry lurched slightly as Captain Sig stopped impelling it forward. The solidified water settled on top of its own wake, slowing as the Merrow swam back to its edge. Sig's silver face broke the surface of the river, and he rose up through the waves to tread water with what appeared to be only mild effort. "You won't have long to wait," Sig said. "The Murmuring bosk is just around the next bend." Sig winked, sank back into the river, and the Shapewater vessel picked up speed. Rhys's ears quivered, and his hand fell to his belt. He felt the reassuring weight of Kulfanor's seed cone and forced himself to breathe normally. He had not seen the Murmuring bosk in many years, but he knew it well. The great sprawling grove served as a kind of parliament for all great treefolk varieties. Oak and ash and poplar were all represented, along with the rare and mysterious varieties of treefolk that were hardly ever encountered outside the deepest, wildest woods. Many of the oldest and wisest treefolks that had ever lived had found their way here to commune with each other, to pool their knowledge, apply it to the present, and preserve it for the future. If Rhys had chosen the path of a seed guide, this was the most likely place he would have ended up. Elves were the only tribe that had ever been admitted to the Murmuring bosk, and generations of seed guides had served here, tending the treefolk sages, petitioning them for their wisdom and serving as ambassadors between the great trees and the blessed nation. He was still thinking of his last visit, lost in the memory, when he felt the saucer bump against the edge of a short, sandy beach and come to rest there. "Ye gods," Sig said. "Damn," Brigid whispered. Aisling pulled her hat back, showing Rhys a face of confusion and concern. "What happened here?" Rhys said nothing. After all he had endured over the past few days, the sight of the Murmuring bosk hit him like a hammer blow. His lungs deflated, his heart stopped beating, and his eyes burned all the way back to his brain. The Murmuring bosk had been leveled. Huge gaping holes in the soil marked where the Parliament of Elders once stood. Carelessly stacked mounds of half-buried wood smoked and smouldered all along the grove's perimeter. Giant boulders that had been buried for centuries lay sundered and broken. dredged from their silent slumber to be shattered into pieces and added to the ugly, heaping piles of ash, mulch, and moist black soil. As nauseating as the sight was, the smell was even worse. The floral scents and woodsy perfume were gone, replaced by a noxious haze of greasy smoke, boiling pitch, and rotting timber. Rhys didn't think it possible, but he found this devastation even more obscene than the sight of his battle with the boggarts. In that case, the destruction had been magical, and his own fault. Here, it was clearly a case of physical force and brute frenzy capable of overpowering some of the most powerful beings in the world. This was not some inexplicable case of powerful magic gone awry or a spell beyond the control of its caster. Magic may well have been involved here, but this was no freak occurrence. Someone had set out to do this with a careful plan and sustained will. Someone had worked for long hours to see it done, and if Rhys had anything to say about it, someone would pay. Rhys shook his head and once more fought back rage and regret, though this time a backdrop of crushing personal guilt did not frame those emotions. He was grateful for that at least. If he had been personally responsible for this horror, as he had been with the other, he would have killed himself on the spot. Better to die than endure another moment of gruesome spectacle. Better to sleep forever than to risk seeing this sight every sunset when he dreamed and knowing that he had created it. As had become his habit when his thoughts drifted to that dreadful event, he pressed 2 fingers to his forehead, threw the glamour to the jagged edge of what remained of his left horn. "What happened here?" Aisling said again. "I don't know." Rhys's voice rasped in his own ears like the hiss of a dying snake. "It had to be giants," Bridget said. "Who else could pull out century-old trees by their roots?" "No," Rhys said. "Giants and tree folk sometimes fight, but only in single combat, or at worst in small groups." He paused, thinking of Brian and Kiel. "This is too wide scale for giants. Too calculated and too complete. Giants might have torn up the trees, but they wouldn't have uprooted them all. Giants wouldn't have burned every last one." He peered sharply at the numerous bonfires. They wouldn't have used axes to split the boughs. They wouldn't have bothered to make individual piles and set each one alight. He clenched his teeth. They wouldn't have been so organized or efficient. Giants did not do this. Bridget scowled, uncertain. "Then who did?" "I don't know, but I will find them and make them suffer," Rhys said. "It's time we went ashore." "Aye." Sig's face was dour, but he did not hesitate despite the gross breach in river protocol. Rhys had committed by giving an order to the captain. Gingerly, as if their steps might somehow increase the destruction they saw, the small party walked from the shapewater and onto the shore of the Murmuring bosk. Rhys turned to Bridget and Aisling. "I swore to honor Colfanor's wishes," he said. Not that the old log had allowed for the state of the place when Rhys arrived. He must have had some inkling, some sense of danger. Perhaps that's why he was so desperate to put Rhys to work. "Now we are here, it is the least I can do." He somberly withdrew the seed cone and clutched it tightly in one hand. It felt warm to the touch, as if eager to get on with it. "Wait here," Rhys said. Bridget's thick fingers traced along the surface of her bow. "Not on your life," she said. With nowhere else to put his rising ire, Rhys vented some of it into Bridget. "This doesn't concern you," he said. "It concerns us all," Aisling said. "We came to assist you. You can't just expect us all to sit here and watch." Rhys shot Aisling an angry look. He should have known that she would not be able to maintain her elf-like demeanor. "It is not permitted," he said. "No one but treefolk and elves have ever been allowed inside the Murmuring bosk." "The Murmuring bosk is no more," Bridget pointed out. "There's no one left to object. Rhys, Aisling said, you can't do this alone. You don't know what's caused it. You do not know if the danger still remains. Let us help you. The former Dane wrestled with his emotions, weighing them against the purely pragmatic streak that all elves shared. Would the time he spent convincing the others, breaking their determination to accompany him, be worth the effort? Follow behind me, he said to the Flamekin and the Kifkin, and say nothing. There was a splash as Sig allowed the shapewater to revert to its natural state with a great sigh of relief. I imagine that's something like what it feels to lay a clutch of eggs, he said to no one in particular. You all go on. I'll be here when you get back. Rhys barely heard a word the Merrow said. The elf strode forward with the seed cone cradled before him in both hands. He did not rush, he did not tarry, but Rhys maintained a deliberate, solemn pace, as if he bore the body of a perfect to a funeral pyre. Bridget and Aisling followed behind, mercifully silent as he had requested. They stayed several paces back, never allowing him to get too far ahead. They were content to be ignored, and he was content to ignore them. Up close, the horror was even more pronounced. There was not a single living adult tree for as far as Rhys could see. Virtually, the only intact plants were a thin line of black poplar saplings along the edges of the mudflats. Black poplars were the most resilient and durable of Lorwyn's treefolk, and were famous for their weed-like ability to recover from devastating injuries. Things grew quickly in the Murmuring bosk, and Rhys had no idea when the grove had been sacked, so he could not gauge how long it had taken these nascent poplars to achieve their current growth. The fact that there was yet life in this place gave him something to pin his hopes on, even if it was in the form of sinewy swamp trees. Rhys reached the spot he had been searching for, the large patch of soil that had once sustained the root system of Culfanor himself. Long before the great red yew had pulled his roots from the earth and taken his first steps. Reverently, Rhys kneeled. He hollowed out a small depression in the dark soil, gently placed the seed cone inside, and then covered the cone over with dirt. Then Rhys bowed his head and said a silent prayer, infusing the seed cone and the ground with some of the oldest and most powerful yew spells. He finished with an ancient blessing for whatever new life sprang from the seed. If anything but an anemic horsetail or a black poplar could spring from this blasted place, he thought bitterly. Rhys, Aisling said, what happens now? The elf stood, but did not want to turn to face his companions. Now we wait, he said. Wait, the archer replied. For what? For a sign, Rhys said. He spun on his heels and fixed the pair with a steely gaze. I must wait to see if the seed will survive. I must make sure my mission is complete. And if your mission can't be completed, Bridget said, if the seed cannot sprout and take root, then I must take it back to Culfanor and seek the yew's guidance. His thoughts hardened as Rhys realized another meeting with Culfanor was unavoidable. He would have to confront his mentor with what he had seen at the Murmuring bosk, and with the question of how much Culfanor had known when he sent Rhys here. How long? Aisling said. How long until you know? A day, Rhys said, at the most. I will know then if Culfanor's teachings have been passed down to the next generation. Bridget considered. We should make a camp out on the bank, she said. I'd like to keep an eye on our fishy friend. An awfully long walk back if he decides to take a long swim without us. Rhys nodded. Good idea. I should collect some. Bridget stopped herself before she said, firewood. Instead, the archer bowed awkwardly and hiked back across the grove. Aisling remained, silent, patiently waiting for Rhys. May I wait with you, Tare? You may, but do not speak. I must try to help this new life emerge. I have a connection to it, and I owe it to Culfanor. He did not mention that if he returned to Colfanor without doing everything he could ensure the seed cone had sprouted, he might as well not return at all, for his mentor would know why he'd failed. But if he remained and tried, and the cone remained in the scorched earth, Colfanor would know that too. Aisling nodded, but said nothing. Thankful once more for her circumspection, Rhys brushed the dirt from his hands, crossed his arms, and stared fixedly at the fresh mound of soft soil. It occurred to the elf that he had absolutely no idea how long it might take for a yew to sprout.